Years ago, I sat down for an interview, and about 90 seconds in, I realized I had accidentally started speaking in a slightly different voice, not an accent. I want to be clear, no accent, just a lower, slower, more serious professional register that I apparently kept in a drawer somewhere. I also realized I was not allowing my back to touch the chair, leaning forward in an almost aggressive posture. I was answering questions in complete, buttoned up paragraphs, like I was narrating a wildlife documentary, using the word synergy unironically and internally thinking, who is this guy? And can he please leave? I didn't get the job. And for a long time, I assumed that was because I wasn't qualified enough. And it took me years and a lot of interviews on both sides of the table to realize the actual problem. I was so busy performing a version of competence that I forgot to let anyone see the actual competence or the actual person, which it turns out is usually what people are trying to hire, promote, or agree with in the first place. This is Live Without an Expiration Date. I'm Rich Jones, and today we're talking about authenticity as a differentiator, not in some abstract leadership philosophy sense, but specifically in the two arenas where most of us perform the hardest and benefit from it the least: interviews and the conversations we have with peers and bosses. There's a boot camp rifle inspection story coming because there's always a rifle inspection story. And by the end of this episode, you're going to have a framework for showing up as yourself in a room where every instinct tells you not to. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Content, quick context if you're new. Over 30 years in financial services, mostly credit unions, a stretch in the Marine Corps before that, and about a decade of my career spent underemployed or unemployed, a period I now refer to generously as involuntary reflection. I wrote a book about it, and I'm still emotionally recovering from writing the book about it. Here's why we're doing this topic. I talk to a lot of leaders in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who are either job searching or navigating some tense internal dynamic: a peer they're competing with, a boss who doesn't seem to hear them, and almost every one of them is doing the same thing I did in that interview years ago. They're performing a version of professional that they think is expected instead of trusting that who they are actually is the more compelling case. So today, what authenticity actually buys you in an interview, specifically against candidates who are all running the same polished playbook. What it buys you in conversations with peers, where trust is the actual currency. What it buys you with your boss when most people either overperform confidence or underperform honesty, and both backfire. I'll tell you about the interview where I accidentally started talking like a documentary narrator, and about the rifle inspection where confidentially wrong got publicly corrected in front of an entire platoon. And we'll close with a framework you can use in your next interview or your next hard conversation, possibly this week. Let's get into it. Segment one: why the interview voice works against you. Let's start with interviews because I think this is where authenticity gets abandoned fastest and most completely. Something happens to otherwise normal, funny, sharp people who the second they sit down across from a hiring manager, they start narrating their own resume like a third person, essentially in that role. They say, in that role, I was responsible for driving cross-functional alignment across key stakeholder groups. Nobody talks like that. Nobody has ever talk like that at a dinner table. And yet we all do it in interviews because somewhere along the way, we decide that sounding like a corporate press release equals sounding qualified. Here's the problem with that strategy, especially if you're an experienced candidate. And this show skews towards people with a couple of decades in their field. So I'm talking to you. If you're 50 and interviewing against candidates who are 35, you cannot out buzzword them. They grew up on this stuff and they will out jargon you every time, effortlessly, because it's native to them in a way that it will never quite be with you. If you try to win an interview by sounding like the more polished, the most on message candidate in the room, you're competing on the one axis where you're not guaranteed to win. But here's what you can do that they don't. 20, 30 years of actual judgment, actual stories, actual scar tissue from decisions that went sideways, and what you learn from them. They can't do that. That's not performable. That's not something a 35-year-old candidate can fake their way into, no matter how good their vocabulary is. And it only shows up if you stop narrating your resume and start actually talking like a person who's lived it. I want to be specific about what authenticity looks like in an interview because I don't want this to sound like just relax and wing it, which is terrible advice, and I never give it. Authenticity is in an interview means answering the actual question instead of the question you rehearsed an answer for. It means saying, "That's a great question. Let me think about that for a second," instead of filling silence with buzzwords. It it means telling a story where you didn't come out looking flawless because the flawless story is the one every other candidate is also telling, and interviewers have heard it 400 times. The story where you got something wrong and what you did next, that one's yours. Nobody else has that story. That's the differentiation. And here's the trust mechanic underneath all of it, because interviewers are pattern matching whether they realize it or not. A polished, over rehearsed candidate reads subconsciously as hiding something, not because they are, but because humans are wired to distrust performances that are too smooth. A candidate who's honest about a gap, honest about a mistake, honest about genuine uncertainty on a question, that candidate reads as safe to hire because the interviewer can calibrate trust to what they're actually seeing instead of guessing what's behind the polish. Okay, time for the rifle inspection story. Let me take you back to the Marine Corps boot camp for a second because this is where I first learned that performing competence and having it on the same thing and having it are not the same thing. And it applies as much to the job interview as it does to a platoon formation. We had a rifle inspection coming, which is essentially an oral exam where the exam is your weapon and the professor is a gunnery sergeant drill instructor who has personally seen God and was not impressed. I don't know my I didn't know my weapon that as well as I should have. Instead of admitting that and cramming, I decided that if I simply projected enough confidence, the drill sergeant would ask me something hard. I was standing at order arms, rigid, with my chin up, the bearing of a Marine who obviously knows everything about his rifle. He asked me one question: the maximum effective range of the weapon I was holding. I didn't know. I answered anyway with total documentary narrator confidence and was completely authoritative authoritatively wrong. He didn't even blink. He banged the rifle barrel off my forehead, said confidentially, confidently, wrong is still wrong. It's just louder. As a side note, I have purposely eliminated several expletives. And then he made sure the entire platoon understand exactly how wrong I'd been by making the entire platoon do 100 squat whoopies. If you don't know, you don't know. I think about that line constantly now, specifically in the context of interviews and tough conversations with bosses, because it's the exact same dynamic. When someone asks you a hard question in an interview, in a one on one, in a performance review, and you don't fully know the answer, the instinct is to fill the silence with confident sounding words. Don't. The interviewer, the boss, the peer knows that version of a listener. Where they, whether they put it in those words or not, confidently wrong doesn't fool them. It just tells them that you're the kind of person who'd rather sound right than be honest. And that's a much worse thing to signal than a simple, I don't know, but here's how I'll find out. The authentic move, the one I didn't have the maturity for at 20, would have been, sir, I don't know, sir. I would still have gotten a bruise on the forehead, but I would have been more honest with myself. And isn't that the goal? Being honest is not a weakness in an interview either. Say that in a job interview when you hit a question you can't fully answer by adding, here's what I will do to find out that answer. Now, in all honesty, that answer would not have worked out in boot camp, but in real life, that authenticity does work. I don't know how I will find out. In a single more underused is the single more underused sentence in the English interviewing language. Segment 2, authenticity with peers, why the safe version loses. Let's let's shift to peers because this one's sneakier. Interviews at least announce themselves as performance. Conversations with peers feel casual, low stakes, and that's exactly why the performance version of you sneaks in without you noticing. Here's the problem I see constantly, especially among leaders competing for the same next role or navigating some quiet rivalry with a colleague. You start managing the relationship instead of having it. You agree in meetings when you actually disagree because disagreeing feels risky. You compliment work you don't actually respect because it's easier than the honest conversation. You start performing collegiality instead of practicing it. And it works for a while. The same way interview polish works for a while. But peer relationships run a longer timeline than a 45-minute interview, and performance doesn't survive a long timeline. Eventually, you disagree about something, and actually, it matters. And your peer has no idea what to do with it because you've spent 2 years signaling, I'll go along with whatever. And now suddenly you're pushing back. And it reads as a betrayal instead of what it actually is. The first honest thing you've said in a while. The differentiation here is subtle but real. The peer who is consistently, predictably honest, even about small things, even about, I don't love this idea, or I think we should go in a different direction, or I'll find out for you. And you actually do find out and get back to them, becomes the peer whose opinion people actually seek out when it matters, not the peer who's most agreeable. You know what they actually think because they've always told you, even when it costs them something small. That's rare. Rare things are sought out. I want to be honest about the cost here because I don't want you to make this sound easy. Being the honest peer sometimes means being the less comfortable person to be around in the short term. It means occasionally being the one who says, I think that's the wrong call in a meeting where everyone else nodded. That's a real cost, but it's a much smaller cost than the one you pay years later when a peer realizes they never actually knew what you thought about anything and stops trusting your input altogether because agreeable and untrustworthy end up looking exactly the same from a distance. So, back to that interview I mentioned at the top, the one where I caught myself talking like a documentary narrator. In a later interview for a senior executive role, a job I genuinely wanted, I knew I was not going to be able to fully relocate because my wife, daughter, and I were primary caregivers for my wife's parents living in an extended family home. Relocating her parents was a hardship, a hard stop. Debating when and how to share this complication, my wife and I were swaying between wait until there's an offer with this waiting waiting until there's an offer with a strategy with a strategy to get an apartment in Indianapolis and commute 10 days on site, Tuesdays through Thursdays, including a weekend in Indy, and 4 days, Friday and Monday, remote in Colorado. About 20 minutes in the interview, it seemed to be going extremely well, and I started performing. I heard myself. I heard the documentary narrative voice. I heard the polished non answer, and I stopped, actually stopped mid sentence, which is its own kind of terrifying in an interview. And I said, actually, let me back up because I want to be transparent about my specific situation about the on site job requirement. I bridged the relocation question with my plan on how I would be present in the role without disrupting our living situation in Colorado. Dead silence for a second, and the interview said, that's the first honest answer we've gotten today. I will have to take this to the CEO to see if this arrangement is workable. It turns out this honesty paid off. I got the job. Not because I tried to hide a constraint, but because I was the only candidate in the room who stopped performing long enough to actually be totally transparent with a major constraint. Was it a risk? Absolutely, because I really wanted that job. Here's the self deprecating part because I think it matters. I almost didn't catch myself. I was several sentences in on autopilot, the same autopilot that's gotten me into trouble before, the same one that had me confidently wrong about a rifle's maximum effective range in front of a drill instructor. The same instinct to perform doesn't go away with experience. It just gets more articulate. The skill isn't eliminating the instinct, it's noticing it fast enough to interrupt yourself before it finishes the sentence. Segment 3, authenticity with your boss. This is the last arena for today, and maybe the highest stakes one, conversations with your boss. This is where I see the most damage done because the incentives to perform are strongest here. Your boss controls your comp, your title, your next opportunity. Of course, the instinct is to manage that relationship carefully, but carefully too often becomes dishonestly, and that's where it backfires. Two failure modes, both of which I personally run. The first is overperforming confidence, telling your boss a project is on track when it isn't because admitting risk feels like admitting failure. This one falls exactly like the rifle inspection. It buys you a bruised forehead and then costs you a lot of credibility all at once, usually in the worst possible moment. The second failure mode is underperforming honesty, sitting on a real disagreement, a real concern about direction, because pushing back on your boss feels risky. I just did this for years in my early career. I disagree in my head, agree out loud, and then feel a slow, low grade resentment building up that eventually leaked out sideways in in hallway conversations, usually at the worst time and the worst way, that if I just said the thing directly the first time, I would have saved myself a lot of grief. The differentiator, the actual competitive advantage, is the employee who tells their boss the true thing early, calmly, and without drama. I don't think this timeline is realistic, and here's why. I disagree with this direction, and here's my reasoning, but I understand if we go a different way. And as a side note, I typically preface this kind of comment with, what I'm going to say may be hard to hear. I say this to prepare the boss, the peer, or the direct report for the intake of bad or unanticipated news. Bosses are starved for this kind of authenticity, genuinely starved. Most people tell them what they think the boss wants to hear, which means most bosses are making decisions with degraded information. The person who reliably gives them the real picture becomes disproportionately valuable, disproportionately trusted, and I watch this happen repeatedly, disproportionately promoted because that boss now has one person in the organization that can actually calibrate against reality. Segment 4 of the framework, authenticity in the room. I recommend a framework I always come back to, applied here specifically. I call it ACRE, ACRE. A, audit your values before you need them. Know before the interview or the hard conversation what you actually think and where your real boundaries are. You cannot improvise honesty under pressure if you haven't done the thinking beforehand. C, calibrate, don't camouflage. Adjust your tone for the room. An interview isn't the same register as a beer with peer. But don't change the actual substance of what you think depending on who's asking. R, reveal the reasoning, not just the result. In an interview, in a disagreement with a peer, in a hard conversation with your boss, show your why. That's the part that builds trust. The polished answer never can. E, expect the cost and pay it anyway. Sometimes honesty costs you a moment of looking less impressive or results in a slightly less comfortable meeting. It's cheaper than the alternative every time on a long enough timeline. So, your homework this week, pick one upcoming interview, one peer conversation, or one conversation with your boss where you normally give the safe, polished answer. Give the honest one instead. Starting with a small version is fine. I don't know, but here's how I find out. Or, I actually disagree, and here's why. Or, that didn't work, and here's what I learned. Watch what it does to the room. It compounds faster than you expect. So, okay, that's authenticity, not as a personality trait, but as the one differentiator available to you in an interview room, a peer conversation, or a one-on-one with your boss that actually actually can nobody else can copy because it's you. You can't out jargon a 35-year-old. You can't out agreeable your way into being trusted by your boss, but nobody can out you. If this episode landed, send it to someone you know who's interviewing right now, or someone who's been quietly performing agreeableness with a boss or a peer for way too long. Because I promise you, they're tired, the same way I was tired for longer than I'd like to admit. Check the show notes for this week's newsletter with the Anchor framework broken down for interviews specifically. Plus, a few real questions to ask yourself before your next hard conversation. Next time, until next time, this is Rich Jones reminding you you don't have an expiration date, and neither does the honest version of you in the room. Go use it.